Welcome back, everyone, to Neighbors in the Network. I'm your host, James Pinedo. Today, we have a great guest, Garrett Ballengee, the Executive Director of the Cardinal Institute for West Virginia Policy. Garrett, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
I feel the same. It's a pleasure to have you. So tell me, I know that you're an executive director, and that to me sounds, I'm new to the movement, so I get a little intimidated. So how did you get to be into this position of executive director? Like, what was your path?
Yeah, I ask myself that question a lot. So I guess we want to go back to like the actual origin story. I had an economics professor in undergrad. It was a small class, Econ 201, and I believe I was a sophomore. And I remember the prompt. There was a question that he asked at the very first minute of the very first class of that semester, and it was, who did more good for the world, Bill Gates or Mother Teresa? And I was so jarred, I think, by the premise of by that question or that prompt, that really sort of like catalyzed my evolution into where I am today in many ways. Because obviously, I think the standard answer is, well, Mother Teresa. Why? I took a different approach after I kind of analyzed the question and made an argument for Bill Gates. And I think I may have been one of the only, there's only like 15 or 20 of us in the class. I may have been the only one who made the argument for Bill Gates. And so that struck up a pretty good relationship between the professor and I. And he kind of really helped start me on my path to where I am today. And so I have been the head of Cardinal for, well, it's been 8 years last week. And I was hired at 27 years old.
Wow.
I got started at 28. And so now I'm an old grizzled vet at 36 with 8 years under my belt, leading this thing called Cardinal.
Wow, that's amazing. So tell me about it. What was your upbringing? How did you at 27, executive director, what motivated that before then?
Well, so after grad school, I had reached back out to that same professor and I was like, look, his name was Matt Ryan. He's now a professor up at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. And I had just got done with a second degree in finance. And I was like, I don't really want to go into investment banking. That was my kind of thing. I wanted to go into finance. I thought that's where you made all the money and you had this kind of glamorous lifestyle and all that kind of stuff. And then I started analyzing that. And I was like, I don't really want to do that. I don't want to do the 70 or 80-hour grind to make an extra buck or two. And so I reached back out to that professor and he said, well, you should check out this program in DC called the Koch Associate Program. And so I applied to that, had no idea how I got in. I was not a libertarian or a free marketeer of any sort, really. I hadn't done any kind of political philosophy classes or anything like that. I got into that program. I ended up working at Koch for about 6 years, I believe, and loved it. I was on the policy team. I studied financial regulation and monetary policy and welfare policy and things like civil society and how that solves society's problems most effectively in most cases. And I just absolutely loved it. But after about 5 or 6 years, I started having this like little kind of like just nagging question is being content a good thing? And so I remember like asking colleagues, I asked my supervisor, like, what do you think about being content? I feel really content right now, but I'm not quite sure I feel fulfilled. And I was on the computer one day during my lunch break, looking at potential other job opportunities. And I saw this brand new organization called the Cardinal Institute. And then I saw it was in my home state of West Virginia. And so I thought, what an amazing opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and apply to this. I am woefully underqualified, woefully unexperienced, but I love my home state and I believe deeply in the principles of freedom. And so I will go ahead and apply. And so kind of just fast forward, I got the job and I remember moving back here to Charleston, although I grew up in a small town, relatively small town, about an hour north of Charleston called Mineral Wells, West Virginia, about 1,800 people. So I moved to Charleston and then I remember showing up, James, in my suit. I bought a new suit. I had a nice tie on. I had no idea what I was walking into. And I get there and I meet my board chairman, the guy who had founded the Institute. And he's like, well, we got to clean out your office. So we got my first couple of days was like cleaning out stacks of manila folders and dusty portfolios and all this kind of stuff. So that was sort of my my introduction to the glamorous life of a nonprofit CEO was cleaning out an old office.
I love that. That's great. So, what were you thinking as you cleaned out that old office? Were you having any second thoughts?
Uh, well, I'd always told myself, like, let's give this 2 or 3 years. If it works, fantastic, right? And if by it works, I mean if we're able to raise money, if we are able to demonstrate a sense of value creation to donors, to stakeholders across the state of West Virginia, and eventually, hopefully, the broader network that is SPN. And if not, you know what? I'll go back to Coke. I loved working there. Again, I was content there. I was happy there. And so to me, there was relatively limited downside other than sort of the hit to my ego potentially that I couldn't do this. And so I sort of, but I think that was also a bit of a kind of a guard for me, which is like, hey, man, if this doesn't work, just go back to Coke. Don't freak out. Because if I allowed myself to think what actually failing at this would mean, then I would be a little bit kind of nervous and concerned about it. But honestly, when I walked into it, I had no idea what to expect. I had no experience whatsoever. Obviously, Cardinal was brand new. I knew I was going to be the only employee and probably the only employee for quite some time. I had never dealt with the board of directors before. I had never tried to fundraise before. And so I was really excited about it, I think, on some level. And whenever I mentioned the being content thing, to me, that's just a fundamentally different kind of precept than being fulfilled. And for me, being fulfilled comes with a sense of challenge and a sense of discomfort. And so it became a question of, do I want to be content or do I want to be challenged? Knowing that challenged means you very well may fail at this, and you may very well take a bit of a reputational hit, a big of, again, sort of an ego hit. And I was okay with that. So, and I'm still here.
Why were you okay with it? Because I'm curious that it doesn't seem like you have a need to do it. You're doing well in your current position. You say you're content. So why were you able to kind of be okay with that?
I don't know. It's just I've always kind of put pressure on myself, I think. By And what I mean by that is not like I need to achieve this, or I've never been terribly ambitious in sort of that credential type of way. It's always, I think sometimes I put some artificial pressure on myself because I think I know that I perform better under pressure, even though I hate the feeling of being under pressure. So what do I mean by that? I tend to procrastinate. I tend to put things off that I really don't enjoy doing, even though I know they need to be done. And once I'm done with them, I feel great about it. And so my whole life, I've made my surroundings more difficult on me than I think what they actually would be or should be. And I do that, I think, subconsciously because I know I perform better that way. And so I'll write a better article or a better blog post if I know I need to have it done in 3 hours than if I start it 3 weeks out. Maybe some folks would disagree, but I just think internally I've always performed better that way. And so then you expand that out, you zoom out with that, and you look at it from a career perspective. To me, starting and leading something like Cardinal, carte blanche, fit very well with that kind of mentality versus continuing with the great career, but cushy, right? And sort of the road was sort of mapped out in some ways working on a large nonprofit in DC. And so, yeah, I don't regret it for a second, but I think if we're going to do sort of the couch analysis, that's why.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you for helping me understand that. That makes complete sense. If you are, I get the sense that the 27 and now 36, you said, Garrett had a desire to do something very outside the norm, not something that was the roadmap ahead, but kind of going off the map. And so going back to your home state to help start something completely new, because there was no think tank like this prior, right? This is kind of the ground floor of something that hadn't started. Yeah,
there was something that was sort of directionally like Cardinal, but it was very kind of stop and start. And so really Cardinal was the first attempt at a liberty nonprofit that was consistent, that was sort of holistic in its approach about affecting change. And so, yeah, we were kind of patient zero in West Virginia.
I like it. Great. Well, I wanted to jump back in your story because I'm not sure if this is completely relevant, but it might be. What was your argument that Bill Gates was better for the world than Mother Teresa? Because that really interests me as well.
Yeah, you're sort of taxing my memory at this point. I'm sure it was something along the lines of job creation and efficiency and the ability for something like Microsoft and Excel and all of that suite of products to really make the world fundamentally more efficient and not sort of this dystopian sort of way, but in sort of the classical sense that we need fewer inputs in order to maximize a certain level of output, which then does what? It frees up other resources who are then able to work in nonprofits or charity or whatever it happens to be. And so I think on some level, the actual argument was less consequential and more of we need to autopsy the world around us, right? We need to actually analyze the world around us and ask these difficult questions about how we create value for others, right? How do we solve problems? And so I think on some level, the conclusion was less interesting. And it was more about how do you actually formulate an argument? And are you being an active participant in the world around you? And I think for a lot of people, they're not really an active participant. They just sort of take the world as it is, right? I think sort of our K-12 education system inculcates that we are here as as sponges of information, right? That we are sponges of certain sort of norms and mores and all of those sorts of things. And then we kind of go forth into the world that's been created for us. And I think those kinds of prompts and those kinds of questions really, I think for certain people will just open up our eyes. And that's certainly what that question did for me.
Yeah. It sounds to me that you were an undergrad then, right? Undergrad when yeah. It sounds
Yeah,
to me
sophomore.
that for an undergrad, answering a question in that way is remarkably analytical and not emotional at all in the way that I would expect an undergrad to be. I think young people often get the rap that we're going to be more on the emotional side. We'll respond more with like instead of the facts, but more of the feeling sort of thing. Is What was that like as an undergrad? Were you out? You were the only person who answered that way in that class. Were you used to being a loner with that kind of thoughts and mentalities? And where did that come from exactly? That's really interesting to me.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've always been, I wouldn't say a loner. I'm content to be by myself.
Yeah.
I'm a natural introvert. I lived by myself in DC for years. I refused to have a roommate. For my final 3 years of undergrad, I was an RA, and so I had no roommate. And so, but at the same time, like I always had friends, was involved in sports and extracurriculars and all that kind of thing. But I just always enjoyed being by myself, and it wasn't to be like standoffish or aloof, although some folks have kind of leveled that criticism at me. It's just because I was discontent kind of doing my own thing.
Yeah.
And I still
Yeah.
hold a lot of those traits to this day. I mean, I was in France by myself for 2 weeks last year, for example. It's just something I enjoy going to lunch by myself. I enjoy sitting in a bar by myself. I like being among people sometimes, but not necessarily a part of sort of a group or something like that, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
It absolutely
It's,
does.
yeah. And so I've just always been kind of that way. And again, like not to be a contrarian or anything like that, but I just sort of see a path. I want to do it. This makes me happy. And if other people don't, but like, this is not to say I'm not an emotional person, because I certainly can be. I'm actually an INFJ, if you kind of believe that those sorts of things, but at least I think it maps pretty well onto my personality type, which I believe is the rarest type of any of them.
Can you remind me? I'm not sure what INFJ means. Sorry. I
So
used
it
to know
is intuitive, introverted, intuitive, feeling, and judging. And
Got
so,
it.
like, if you kind of map that out, and when I tell people that, it's a little bit surprising to them. But anyway, when you kind of map it out, it doesn't leave a lot of room for sort of like just hardcore analytical thinking. It's more of an intuition or gut feeling based decision making tree. But that's obviously not a hard and fast rule. But
Sure,
yeah,
sure.
man, I don't know. I've just always been very content to be myself, and I think that manifests in some interesting ways, career wise.
It certainly has. Man, that is, I love that journey that you mapped out for us. So now you're 27 years old. You're starting with the Cardinal Institute, which is also starting.
Mm-hmm.
How's that journey been from then till now?
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, man. Do you like thrill rides, roller coasters, anything like that?
I do.
Yeah, well, you can see where I'm going with this then. It's been a heck of a journey. I was the only employee for about a year and a half. And then we hired our second employee, and then it was just the two of us for another year and a half. And she would sit on one side of the desk, and I would sit on the other side of the desk, and we would just sort of work in tandem. And then we hired our second employee after her, and so it was really just two of us for 3 years. And now we're up to, I think, 7 or 8 people.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. But it's been really tough. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I think we've benefited from the fact that we've had something of a vacuum here in West Virginia in terms of ideas. The state was sort of changing philosophically and politically, which was certainly beneficial to something like Cardinal. There were certain issues that I think now are obvious, like school choice, that really had no one owning those topics. And so when we would do kind of how do we improve the state of West Virginia, what are some things that we need to work on? Like education reform was a very obvious thing. And so we've certainly had some breaks along the way, but and again, we were sort of formed in a fertile environment. But it's not been sort of this linear growth where I hire this person, then budget grows, then hire next person, budget grows, that kind of stuff. We've had, especially in the early days, some ups and downs. There was one time, I think it was 2017, 2018. I wasn't quite sure we were going to make payroll like in the next 2 weeks. And we'd had 3 or 4 employees on staff. And I'll tell you what, that really sort of focuses the mind in terms of how do we actually take this thing and build it so I can actually sleep at night knowing that employees with mortgages or getting married or going to get married are going to be fine and taken care of, especially at that age, 29, 30 at that point. It was a lot of stress, man. I'm not going to lie. But now we're in a much less perilous position. I'll put it like that. But yeah, it's been a ride. It's what I signed up for. On some level, I knew in a state like West Virginia, starting and sustaining and building a think tank would be a difficult thing to do. And so on some level, it was stressful, but on another level, I had no sympathy for myself because I knew what I was getting into.
Right. Yeah, it was what you signed up for, like you said. But now looking back and with the gift of hindsight, was the stress worth it?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Why?
For sure. And I think that sort of helped my thinking on the fulfillment comes through challenge. Fulfillment doesn't come through contentment. And so if you've looked at what Cardinal's been able to achieve, I mean, literally just like directly, thousands of people have benefited from Cardinal's efforts. Right? Even if you just want to take the 6,000 or 7,000 kids on the ESA program here in West Virginia, and by that I mean Education Savings Account, which is a form of private school choice.
It's the Hope.
That doesn't happen with what's that?
It's the Hope Scholarship, right?
Yeah, the Hope Scholarship. That doesn't happen without Cardinal. Now, that's not to say that we were the only mover on that, but we brought that concept to West Virginia. We helped build the coalition, and then we did all the necessary effort that's required for a transformational change like that. Because prior to that, West Virginia had no school choice whatsoever. And so, and I sort of liken it to, we went from a fire in a cave to nuclear fusion within about 5 or 6 years. And so even if we just wanted to narrow direct impact, 6,000 or 7,000 kids and families who now have a certain type of financial agency that they did not have 7 years ago, then yeah, I'll take a few sleepless nights for that and a little bit of irritability and that kind of stuff. I think it's absolutely worth it. And I think that's more often than not the case.
That makes sense. Yeah, difficult things. I remember I was speaking to an old buddy of mine who we went to high school together, and then he went to be an Army Ranger. And he was telling me about he had some really rough experiences as a ranger, and he was like, well, I found the difficult things generally are the ones that are the most meaningful when you do them.
Well, like you've got your movie poster there, the extrovert behind you. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a very like directing a film is a difficult thing, right? I mean, it's
sure.
just and I think sometimes I look at all my friends and they want to be, and I'm not judging anybody by I mean, I was almost this kind of person, but and there are good reasons to do this, but you go to law school and then you ask them why, I don't know. It's just it gives me 3 years to try to figure life out, or they want to be an accountant or whatever. And we need good lawyers and we need good accountants and all these sorts of things. The world does not run without those kind of people. But I do think there's a sense of just sort of I think one of the main problems actually with our K-12 system is we create this sort of path dependence for a lot of people whenever they're sort of missing out on kind of these other aspects of their personality or skill set or acumen, and they're just never able to really cultivate that into an actual kind of fulfilling path. They'll be content. There's no doubt about that.
Mm.
Be content with your lake house, right? You can be content
Mm.
with your 2 or 3 vacations a year, but I think there is a bit of a crisis of fulfillment, and I put that squarely on the shoulders of our K-12 system in some ways.
Is that part of, because this really, Garrett, this you're saying things that really interest me, and I know this might be a little bit off the rails because but I want to ask it. So, is that lack of meaning, that lack of fulfillment that you're speaking to? Because when you say lack of fulfillment, I also think of lack of meaning. Like why am I doing what I'm doing, and what all that type of stuff. Is that something that's part of our movement? Is that something? It seems to be something you're thinking about, not just in yourself, but you mentioned the K through 12. Is that something that our movement is working on as well as a whole, or at least are you working in the Cardinal Institute on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think fundamentally, our movement is about removing the hurdles and artificial barriers that are put in the place of people trying to find fulfillment. And so, like for example, and I know this is like a weird exit ramp to this, but like I take something like occupational licensing, which
Mm-hmm.
is sort of a government enforced barrier between the individual and their chosen career path. And to me, some of that may be logical, right? A lot of people may agree with certain types of licensing for doctors, for example. We can have a debate about that. But I think some of the licensing, particularly for those folks at the lowest levels of the economic ladder, right? The lowest rungs of the economic ladder, we need to really interrogate these things. And it's
Mm.
not just so like they can, put money in a 401k. It's also so they can author their own story. And I think so many of these government hurdles are just kind of taking the pen away from people to continue to continue the analogy. It's so yeah, I think it's absolutely what our movement is doing, and from education reform to occupational licensing to things like criminal justice reform. All of these, I think, are branches of that same tree, and that tree is a fulfillment tree, a meaning tree.
I love it. Okay. Well, this is an area of the movement that I'd never thought about much, and now I want to think a lot about it. Thank you for helping shed light on that area. I want to circle back to a little bit more on the path now that we had set for ourselves. So you mentioned to me like a specific impact that you had that you really, that was incredibly meaningful, where the Hope Scholarships don't happen without Cardinal. That's great. And you also mentioned to me a specific challenge that you had making payroll. Were there other others that you have that really kind of stick out in your time now as executive director of Cardinal Institute?
Yeah, in terms of challenges or
Either,
successes, yeah,
either.
oh for sure. Yeah, for sure. So in terms of successes, I'll just take one of the most recent. So there's this esoteric type of law called a certificate of need, which is just like this little nefarious Soviet style central planning regime when it comes to healthcare, where a provider, a healthcare entrepreneur has to ask the government for permission to, for example, purchase an MRI machine or to add beds to their hospital or to be able to effectively treat something like COVID, by hiring nurses, adding beds, adding all of these sorts of things. All of these are under a regime called Certificate of Need in West Virginia and 35 other states. And so when we arrived on the scene, there was really nobody talking about Certificate of Need. I mean, it was just one of those things. We had other problems, we had other fish to fry. And so about 4 years into our lifespan, we just started talking about it. We said, this is a ridiculous thing to put in the place of one of the least healthy states, of one of the states that suffers from a lack of investment, from a lack of healthcare, very limited healthcare access. And so we decided to take that on. And so we did papers on it. We would talk about it in op-eds. We built the coalition. And so finally, this year we had a modicum of reform, where we finally removed the requirement of Certificate of Need for birthing centers. We are a state of 1.8 million people, James. We had one birthing center ran by midwives in the entire state of West Virginia. And we would talk to midwives and they would say, yeah, the Certificate of Need regime in West Virginia is so burdensome that there's only one that's been able to kind of get through. And we had heard stories of nurses and midwives that had moved to like Maryland, a bordering state, for example, to start thriving birthing center businesses that now had 10 nurses and had done tons of births and all these kinds of things. So that was absolutely something that we said, you know what, we have to work on this. And so, yeah, that was finally removed. There were some other kind of nibbling around the edges reforms on certificate of need. And so that's another thing that really doesn't happen without Cardinal. And so, and again, this is not to say that we are the only mover in these things. You know, monumental victories require monumental efforts. And so there were a lot of groups, a lot of good people doing a lot of good things. But that was one of those things that we were really the catalyst for. In terms of challenges, I mean, especially for, I think, nonprofit workers, there's no clear delineation, I think, sometimes between the personal and the professional. And so if sort of the professional side deteriorates, the personal side deteriorates, right? And vice versa. And so I think kind of making sure that the personal self and the professional self are both healthy, are both energetic and sort of kind of in unison, kind of in harmony is really important. I know I had some problems with that, particularly a couple of years ago with my wife and I were going through a very tough time with the birth of our daughter. And so that was a really tough thing. And I think one of the important things is trying to build a team that can kind of pick up the slack, right? Whenever perhaps the personal is kind of dragging down the professional. And so that is something that, we've had to overcome and kind of forge a path through over the last couple of years. And luckily we're on the other side of that now. But yeah, that was some difficult times. And I remain immensely proud, not of just of my staff, but my board and this wonderful network that is State Policy Network, for really kind of helping us out and get through some of these tough times. So yeah, there were definitely some sticky situations there, no doubt. But again, it's all been worth it.
I'm glad. I'm sorry that you guys were going through that tough time, your wife and your child. It seems like that's when something like that happens, all the stuff I'm worried about at work is like, it seems so insignificant after that. But go ahead, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I sort of look at it, I was sort of like an apparitional employee, right? Like an apparition, like a ghostly presence. I was sort of there. I was sort of present, but it was sort of a hollowed out version of who I was. And I think being able to identify and build a staff, not just because they check all the sort of the credentials or because, they really experience in this particular thing that we really need, but folks that kind of in a nonprofit setting are able to pick each other up holistically, right, is such an important thing, because we get into this nonprofit movement because we feel a sense of just really strong pull towards it, right? Or at least we stay in this movement because of that. And so again, being able to divorce the personal and professional is very difficult for nonprofit people, particularly sort of the higher I think you go up in leadership in terms of hierarchy or something like that. And so I think just talent identification and trying to find subtle clues or hints for people that will be good, not just on, again, on the professional side, but also the personal side is very, very important to a successful organization.
That makes complete sense. That's a trick though, knowing how to marry those two in hiring. That seems like it should be a subject of a whole podcast on its own.
Yeah, and if you ever know anybody that bats 1,000 on that, I'd love to meet them. And it's something it's sort of a spider sense that we develop over time, no doubt. But yeah, it's so important for a successful organization.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I have a ton of other questions, but I know we're getting close to time, and I want to respect your time. So, tell me, what are the biggest challenges and worries that you have for your state and then as a country at large?
Oh man. Wow. So I think in terms of challenges, I think as a movement, sort of becoming like the victims of our own success. By that, I mean, we're really able to, let's just take education as an example. We're really seeing kind of a renaissance in education reform, right? So we only had like one state that had an ESA for a very long time. Then we had a couple states. Now we're up to, I think, 9 or 10 that have near universal education choice. So you sort of like check that one off the box a little bit, although those successes create other challenges and things like that. Tax reform, I think the overall conservative movement since Reagan has been very successful in tax reform. I think we've won a lot of that argument. West Virginia, for example, just passed its first income tax reduction in 30 years. You're seeing a lot of states progressively lower their corporate income tax or net income tax or personal income tax rates. And so you look at something like criminal justice reform or licensing, like we really are starting. I know it's a long slog and I know the mountain is steepest when you get to the closest to the summit, but we're very successful. And so what I spend a lot of time about is what does our movement kind of 2.0 look like? Not just in terms of like, how can we make a big difference in the world around us, but like, how do we keep movement employees engaged, right? How do we attract people to our ideas? And so what is the next set of policy areas that we can really kind of set our searchlight on and say, look at this problem, we need to fix it. And we feel like we as conservatives, libertarians, free marketeers, fusionists, whatever, we feel like we have the right solutions. And here's why you should listen to us. And here's why you should support us. And again, not just from a kind of box checking sort of way, but because we're actually trying to grow our movement. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that in terms of personal or organizational challenge. What does smart growth look like? That's something that I think is always difficult. How do we grow? When do we grow? How do we expand our mission if we feel like that's necessary, right? And so like West Virginia, for example, has a lot of problems. It's a very poor state. It always has been. It's sort of the epicenter of the opioid crisis. I wonder if we have lost an entire generation basically in West Virginia. What does that mean for our policy environment? What does that mean for economic growth? What does that mean for this crisis of meaning that we talked about earlier? What does that mean for a downstream issue like foster care? West Virginia is also kind of the epicenter of the foster care crisis. Well, foster care is not really a traditional kind of policy area for much of the conservative or libertarian movement. Some people view it as more of a kind of a social issue, which I vehemently disagree with. And so how do we convince other groups to work on something like foster care? How do we try to shift our donors into caring about something like that? I think a lot of people from the outside, they think, well, groups like Cardinal work on something because donors donate to us to work on something. I actually think that relationship is reversed, or at least it can be reversed on some level, which is we as a movement have to make the case for these new and different issues and policy areas to our donor network to say, like, this is why this is important, this is how we're going to solve it. So I think that's something else that I've been thinking a lot about as well.
It seems like when you describe it that way, do think tanks and especially Cardinal, because we're speaking about Cardinal, do they operate like scouts in the community where they say this is the danger and they report it back and then hopes that then resources come forward, like they request the resources to solve that danger that's happening?
Yeah, I think that's a role that we can and should play. It's obviously not our only role,
Right.
but I think one of the advantages of our network is exactly that function. And then convincing our peers that it's important to work on it. And then going out one more concentric circle, convincing the donor class to work on it.
Right.
And then another concentric circle, convincing kind of the media and the broader kind of national conversation that these are important issues. And then even more importantly, that our solutions are the correct solutions. And so I know whenever I go to something like annual meeting, I learn from all of my peer CEOs. I learn from donors that I talk to. And so that scout function, I've never heard it put that way. I like that though. Is definitely a critical role for us for sure.
Great. Okay. Well, I do you have a couple more minutes for me to ask two
I don't
more
have anything until 1 o'clock. So
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Thank you. So, I was fascinated by your podcast that Cardinal puts out, Forgotten America. I love even the title itself, that we're talking about. It seems like almost a lyric sort of title, or you put into a ballad that some sort of minstrel's playing off in the corner, almost that sort of thing, because you're speaking to something that has been lost, and then you're trying to bring it back into the light so that people can appreciate that which you see as worthwhile. At least that's what I think of when I see that title. And I was listening to it this morning, and great podcast. Highly recommend people to check it out. But I was struck by, you have a focus on storytelling and stories with this. Is that kind of the motivation? What brought about this whole podcast? Can you give me some idea?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we are first and foremost storytelling creatures, right? And so that's how we originally learned, was stories being passed down generation over generation. And while I love a good white paper as much as the next dork, um, our movement has done this over the last 10 to 15 years, tried to focus a little bit more on the storytelling side of things. And so that's just, the podcast is kind of manifestation of that recognition of that just sort of simple human reality. But if we will rewind it, it was back in 2016, President Trump had just been elected as president, and you had all of these sort of not athletic, Atlantic. I've got football on the mind, sort of opening.
Oh, same.
Yeah.
First year that Texas has been relevant since I went there. So
yeah, for sure. For sure. And so you had like the Atlantic, you had the New Yorker, you had the New York Times, you had all of these organizations would send out kind of reporters to the hinterlands of America and try to figure out why these people are voting this way. Why are they angry? Why are they scorned? Why are they reactionary? All this kind of stuff. And I thought, this is absolutely ridiculous. These same organizations would be, I think, ashamed to send a lot of these same people out to like inner city Baltimore to try to tell the story of inner city Baltimore, right? They would try to find people that are of the environment, that can relate to the environment, that are sympathetic, if not empathetic, to the plight of those people. And there was none of that. And I think speaking about the conservative movement now, there was really nothing dedicated to kind of telling the story of this fusion of like rural Americans, of which there's 65 million of us, freedom in public policy. And so we wanted to start, and so we felt forgotten. And so we wanted to start something that, at least on some small marginal level, we could actually start having conversations about freedom and public policy and rural America or Appalachia, however you want to characterize it, and really just begin telling our own story. And so that's sort of, we're kind of going to take this and other places, I think, as an organization that I'm excited about. And so that was really the genesis. We wanted to talk amongst ourselves for an external audience, really in the first dedicated way. If you look at, are you familiar with the Hatfields and McCoys, James?
yes.
Of course you are, right? We all are, even 150 years past that feud and the way it was covered, sort of this Scotch-Irish clannishness, these kind of hillbilly rednecks, violent, clannish, suspicion of outsiders or those that are not of the clan. that was really kind of and this was reported on by big East Coast city, New York Times, Baltimore newspapers, Philadelphia. That was really the genesis of this kind of idea that these people, and by that I mean Appalachians or rural Americans, are different, and they're different in a suboptimal way. And we've been dealing with the sort of the burden of that kind of national perspective over the last 150 years. And Forgotten America is not going to shift that or change it, but it's a recognition that we need to start doing something about it, and telling our own stories in a really systematic way.
Well, I am fascinated to hear what I was hoping you would say, that you have you have vision for where you want to take more and build more from the podcast, which is already great as it is. And I can't wait to hear or see what those things are. That's brilliant. And I 100% agree. You can ask my wife how often I rail against like just the lack of stories from, I wouldn't call Forgotten America, because that wasn't in my mind, but from Middle America, from those areas that we haven't heard about. What I think about all the time is like watching Ozark on Netflix, and you're like, this is not the story of rural America that I know. And it's great storytelling, but it's still not the voice that we're looking for. And I'm fascinated to see where you go with your next project. So please keep us in the loop. Thanks for.
Oh, absolutely.
Great. Okay. So besides that, what are the future hopes and goals that you have there at the Cardinal Institute?
Oh man, I'm terrible with these kinds of questions. They're all kind of related to like, where do you see yourself in 3 years, or where do you see it? I am very much a Forrest Gump closing scene, feather in the wind kind of person. But I would say this: I want it to be characterized by impact, and so whether that's being strategic on the way that we implement the Hope Scholarship Program in West Virginia, so that it actually lives up to its family-friendly billing. So we want to be involved in that, making sure that folks are aware of the Hope Scholarship is something that I think our movement needs to do a better job on. It's identifying things like foster care, right? Like, how do we, as a conservative organization, how do we make a difference, or at least have something to say about something like foster care, so we can actually improve that situation? How does a group like Cardinal really kind of dive into this idea that we ought to be the connective tissue for solutions and problems in this whole state, and maybe this broader region that is Appalachia? And so I think over the next 5 years, you're going to see us continue to work on West Virginia centric problems, offering West Virginia solutions, at the same time have an eye towards, well, if this works for West Virginia, what about the 25 million people in Appalachia? How do we bring our voice to this broader region in a way that's effective? And so I'm sure we'll have many tests and failings and all that kind of stuff. But I think, just to sum it up, we want to be impactful, and we want to be impactful in kind of an innovative way, if you will.
Love it. Sounds like a plan. Can't wait to see it.
You and me both, my friend. You and me both. So we'll see how it goes. But I'm excited about it.
Nice. Okay. Well, last question. Can you nominate anyone for us to interview next here on Neighbors in the Network?
Oh my goodness. This is sort of like asking me my favorite child or dog. Have you had D. Hicks on?
We haven't.
So D. Hicks was a very important mentor for me, particularly in my early days, and it was somebody that SPN had set me up with. Just a great man, a great person, somebody who I think has a very effective 30,000-foot view of our movement and some of the challenges that we're facing. So I always learn something from D, and so I'm sure that your other listeners will as well.
Wonderful. I'm going to look forward to learning from him too, because if he's a mentor of yours, he must be pretty cool. So thank you very much, Garrett. I really appreciated getting to know you, and thank you for sharing your story.
Likewise. Thank you for having me on, James.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Neighbors in the Network, an offering from the State Policy Network. We hope that this podcast can serve as a place for empathy, understanding, and human connection. Please let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. And thanks again.